Dr. J are working on. And then the content for your quiz is going to come from the Monday lecture courses. So, so Dr. Young's session and lecture session at the beginning of the course, in terms of what he lectured on Monday, is fair games for your quizzes. My stuff, and I'll before I leave, I'll probably give you like a review of maybe 1 or 2 or 3 test questions, not test questions, but quiz questions that you could expect from me. But once again, the objective of this course, and if you think about the content that we're going through, we're talking about the research process, we're talking about literature review, and so it's not going to be anything too critical, but it's going to be stuff that I talked about in class or in the lecture material. And so for the most part, that's going to be the basis of your quiz. It's not designed to fail you. It's not designed to give you it's designed so that you just have a basic understanding of. And a lot of you guys did undergraduate research projects. You probably wrote papers or courses. And so a lot of this stuff that we're going through, the content is a little bit dense, but for the most part, it's stuff that you've seen before. And so don't freak out when you hear quiz. It's just designed to kind of like assess what you've been learning thus far, and if we can clarify and make anything clear, that's what our purpose is in terms of the quizzes. All right. So we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about literature review and research questions. Right. So this is just a recap from last week. We talked about the research process, and essentially it's a five-part components of the research process. So the first part is you want to identify a research question. Typically, when I am trying to develop a research project and I'm trying to identify a research question, the foundation for me to be able to identify a research question is my literature review. And so the literature review essentially is what's the current state of event in the literature for the topic that you're interested in. Say, for example, if you're looking at antiretrovirals for HIV, you want to know what's current, what is the most current topic, and then based on reviewing the most current topics for your antiretroviral drugs, then you can develop a research question. So the foundation of identifying a really good or really great research question is a really good or thorough literature review. All right. Then you're going to select the study approach, which is your methodology. You're going to design the study, collect data. You want to analyze your data, and then you want to report your findings. Typically, you're going to be disseminated in some kind of, it could be a community newsletter, it could be a scientific journal, or something along those lines. All right. So the core of this lecture, or the first core of this lecture, we're going to talk about reviewing the literature, and then the next part we're going to talk about research questions. Right. So one of the things that I was able to find, I found a really cool YouTube video on Google. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to break things up a little bit, so I'm not just standing up here and just giving you guys a dense lecture on stuff that you probably are well versed or you probably know a lot about. So what I'm going to do today is a 5-minute video, and this is a researcher at Carnegie Mellon University, and what she's done, she just gives us a lot of the content from her little 5-minute video. I'm going to go over the course of the lecture material. So I'm going to try to see if I can incorporate some of her content into what we're going to talk about today. All right. And I hope that distant campuses can hear and...
Hi everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to use Google Scholar to do a review of scientific literature. Now, I like using Google Scholar to do a literature review for a couple of different reasons. The first is that Google does a pretty good job of indexing journals and conference proceedings and databases and finding all of the relevant work that exists online. The second is that Google gives us a couple of nifty tools that we can use to peruse the literature and discover new things as we're looking. So let me show you how to use Google Scholar with an example. Let's say that what we want to find in our literature review is about social eye gaze in robotics. So the first thing to note is that you can use the same kinds of Google tricks in the search bar here as you can during the normal Google search. This means that we can use capital or to request a Boolean search, for example, or virtual agents. It also means that we can use quotes to put a particular phrase, to search for an exact version of a particular phrase. So here, this would search Robotics and Robotics for the French Virtual Agents. So let's hit enter. And we can see the Google gives us a long list of results. And it gives us the title of the paper, the authors here who wrote the paper, an indication of where it was published, although this is often hard to read, and a year. So you can go up and click directly on any of these links. This will take you to either a PDF of the article directly, in which case there will be a little PDF indication on the left-hand side of the title. Or it might take you to a web page of a conference or a journal that has published this work, and access to the article after that may or may not be behind a paywall. Google will also tell you on the right-hand side here if the article is available directly as a PDF. And if it is, it will tell you what website is hosting that PDF. That's because sometimes PDFs aren't hosted only by the journal or conference that has published the work, but, for example, authors might post the PDFs on their own personal pages. Now, when you do literature review, it's important to get a wide range of research from a wide range of times. So you want to look for work that is historical, that might have been published a little bit longer ago, and also for more recent articles that really demonstrate the state of the art in the field. So Google lets us filter the publication date of the articles that we're looking for. So we can click since 2013 and find only articles that have been published in the last 4 years. This helps us narrow down the scope to the most recent work. You can also define a custom range if you want to find work within particular sets of years. Now, if you read the references from a particular paper, you'll be able to find relevant articles that were published before that paper came out. But Scholar gives us a nice way of finding articles in the future that actually cite the work that we're interested in. So let's say, for example, that we have a particular article that we like, and we want to know other research that has cited that article that's interested in it. We can click on the Cite and Bio link. And that will take us to a list of papers that have cited the article that we are most interested in. Another nice tool is that we can then click on Search Within Citing Articles and do an entirely new Google search with inside the articles that are citing the article that we're most interested in. And this way you can really narrow down your topic of interest. So let's go back to the main list of articles. Another useful tool that Google gives us is that it lets us sometimes click on specific author names to find that author's research profile. So for example, we can click on my name here, and you can find a Google Scholar profile, which I set up with a picture of myself and my affiliation. And Google automatically indexes all of the articles online that are published by me. And they're automatically sorted by how often they've been cited, but you can also click on year to sort by recency. And sometimes looking at the articles that a particular author has written in the past few years might be informative in developing your literature review. And finally, Google gives us a nice way of citing, of figuring out how to cite individual articles. So if you click on the cite link beneath each article, you can see that you get the citations in a number of different standardized formats. And in fact, if you scroll down to the bottom, you can also get the citation in BibTeX format, which is a text format that you can copy directly into your bin file, which is especially helpful for computer science students. I do recommend checking the citation info because oftentimes Google automatically generates it, and there may be some weirdness or errors in the way it has handled the title or the journal title. So that was a whirlwind tour of how to use Google Scholar to do a literature review. Please let me know in the comments if you use different techniques or if you use other mechanisms for finding literature when you're doing a search of academic work. Thanks for watching.
So I thought that was a really cool, short video in terms of, this is something that I use on a daily basis. So I use Google and I use PubMed and I use other database engines to look for journal articles. The really cool thing about Google Scholar is that if you're on campus here at UGA, it automatically syncs to your to the network here at UGA. And so typically you'll actually assign it so that you can access journal articles or whatnot. But it's a really cool nifty kind of way to look at, just get a quick and dirty look at a literature, or to do a quick literature review. All right. So one of the things that the video talks about was informational sources, and so that's a part of a literature review. So informational sources, it could be non-technical information from trusted sources like the CDC, the World Health Organization, can provide you with a helpful background on any topic or topic. One of the things that I use a lot is because a lot of my research focused primarily on cancer, prostate cancer outcomes, so I use the American Cancer Society. They have a really cool cancer facts and figure publication that comes out every year. Fact sheets and other information are not part of formal peer-reviewed scientific literature. Don't cite them in formal reports. So say for example, if you were interested in third-year pharmacy students' outcomes on a test, and the college puts out, which it probably wouldn't because it would be in violation of FERPA, but essentially it gives it sends out a fact sheet of where the third years are in terms of a specific course. That is essentially a fact sheet. And so if you're writing a formal report, essentially what they're saying here is don't include them in as it relates to a formal report. Now you could develop an educational study, and that would become a part of a formal report if it was an educational study, right? Statistical reports, so these are annual reports from groups like the American Cancer Society, Population Reference Bureau. Information from state and local health departments are essentially population reports. So this is an example of the American Cancer Society Facts and Figures for 2019, and it's essentially a comprehensive look by state at specific kind of cancer, the population for the year, estimates, and so it's a very well trusted source for cancer facts and data when you're looking at cancer research. So the next thing, when we're talking about a literature review, we're going to talk about abstract databases. And so Google is a database that is able to allow you to search for full text articles, but you can also look for abstracts as well. So an abstract is a paragraph length summary of an article, chapter, or book. So typically an abstract, I'll give you an example. This is an example of an abstract. So this paper was published in 2018, and it's a paper that was published in the American Society of Clinical Oncology, and basically it's a synopsis of a conference. So the conference that was hosted, it was a conference that was hosted in Philadelphia, and it's the Philadelphia Prostate Cancer Consensus Conference in 2017. And essentially the whole objective of this conference was to look at the role of genetic testing for inherited prostate cancer risk. And so what you see here is just a brief summary of what the article is about. And so you usually have purpose, methodology, results, and conclusion, and it's just a really condensed overview of the entire research article. And so that's an example of an abstract. Here's another example of an abstract. Genetics, genomics, and cancer risk assessment. And so this was an article that was published in 2011 from the American Cancer Society, and essentially just a summary of what the researchers did. It says, we describe the scope of knowledge, tools, and expertise required for the translation of complex genetics and genomic test information into clinical practice. And so that's essentially this is the purpose of the study that researchers are giving you a description of. Abstract databases, so in order to find, say for example, you're doing a research or you're doing some kind of systematic review or some kind of literature review and you want to just get an example, you don't want to spend your time reading 200 full-text journals. So the first step is to essentially do a PubMed, Google search, or one of these search engines, and to just click the abstract box, and essentially just gives you a summary of the research article, so you can narrow your research based on, or narrow the articles based on what is of interest to you. This is an example of PubMed. So essentially this is the database. You go to PubMed and you type in your research topic, and it generates thousands or hundreds of topics or articles published, peer-reviewed publications, and then essentially you can narrow it based on the abstracts that you're interested in. After you've narrowed your research question or the articles based on what you're interested in, then you can decide to go ahead and pull full text articles. These are other examples of Web of Science, Embase, Medline, or other examples of abstract databases. So one question that, just looking at information, why would you search multiple databases? So for example, PubMed and Web of Science and Embase, they may all have different specific research articles or different studies. So one study like PsycInfo might just have psychology studies. PubMed is a medical database that indexes research related to the medical sciences. And so depending on your specific scientific discipline, for a lot of you guys who are pharmacy-related or pharmacy-based clinicians, you're going to use PubMed a lot because that's going to be a quick source for finding clinical studies related to your area of practice. So you would probably use PubMed a lot. I use PubMed a lot because I'm interested in disease outcomes and so on. All right, I'm not going to go into. So one of the things that you noticed from the video, you noticed the researcher, she used this thing called Boolean operators. So say, for example, if you're doing a research study and you want to study, you don't want to just limit it to one topic, you can use these Boolean operators known as and, or not. So as you're doing your search terms, you can put them in and you can say, okay, I'm interested in studying prostate cancer, androgen deprivation outcomes, and survivorship. And so those are some of the things that you can use when you're looking at Boolean operators. Okay, so full text articles. So after you've gone through and you've looked at abstracts, and now you say, okay, when you did your initial search, you came up with 1,000 articles, and you're like, okay, that's a lot of reading, that's a lot of articles to go through. And then after you narrow your search down, you probably narrowed it down to 25. So you got 25 articles that are very specific and very condensed to the things that you're interested in studying. Where would you find full text PDF copies of these entire articles? So UGA Library subscription, the University of Georgia Library is very comprehensive, and so you have access to interlibrary loans. You can also do e-journals, and so that's one way of pulling full text article. Once again, Google Scholar is usually indexed. If you are doing a search on campus, it recognizes the UGA network, and so a lot of times you'll say find at UGA. So you do your search term, the journal pops up and it says find at UGA. You click at find at UGA and it goes right to the library, and you can download the full text journal article. PubMed Central or other open access repositories are ways for you to find full text articles. Now the other thing that I do a lot sometimes, say for example, I check at UGA and UGA doesn't have it. I check with interlibrary loan doesn't have it. I do all these other. I look at PubMed Central. PubMed Central doesn't have it. The other thing that you can do is when you publish a journal article, you usually have to give your contact information so that somebody can follow up with you or request a copy of the article. So there are times in which I have to email an editor or email an author and say, hey man, please have a copy of your article. I'm doing this study at UGA, and I think that this article is a missing puzzle in my overall study, and so would you be so kind to give me a copy of your article? And sometimes people don't respond, and then you're like, okay, well, I guess I'm gonna have to find another way to get it. Or they'll respond and say, here, thank you so much for using my article. You're gonna cite me, you're gonna give me fame and all this other stuff, and so they'll give you your article. The other way that I get around, if I email an author and they don't give me a copy of their paper, I have colleagues at other institutions, and so what you see in this room is very important, because you're gonna have your colleagues that you're gonna when you're practicing or when you're doing research, and you can say, hey Steve, I'm doing a study. does your university or does your organization have access to this journal? And he'll say, okay, or Steve will say, hey, yeah, I have access to this journal. Why don't you, can you help me find this, and can you help me find this this paper? And Steve will just send me a paper. And so I've worked in situations where one of the really cool things is about being a faculty member at UGA is that you can be adjuncts at other institutions. So I'm an adjunct assistant professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. There are times that I'm doing research and I can't find articles at UGA just because the University of Georgia doesn't subscribe to certain articles. And then I just log in with my UNC credentials and I get the articles. Or I'm also an associate cancer member of the Winship Cancer Institute at Emory, so I spend a lot of time driving down to Emory to meet with mentors, and there are times that because I have those affiliations, it's important that it gives me access to things that I can't have access to, and so that's an advice for you. So don't just limit yourself to your institution. You never know what you can get access to just by going to, and the reason why I got access to the stuff at Emory was that I was here at UGA and I saw that they were having monthly cancer meetings. Wingship has a comprehensive cancer center, and I would just drive down to their weekly meetings, and they go, hey, you're a professor at UGA, would you like to have associate membership to Wingship? I'm like, are you kidding me? Why not? And so here I am, and that kind of stuff, it benefits my research, it benefits the kind of clinical studies that I can do because I have access to really awesome mentors, but not only that, but I have access to a world of research that I wouldn't have access to. And UGA is great, UGA has a lot of really, really awesome resource, but they can't have access to everything. And so you're going to run into situations where you're just not going to have access to everything that you would like. And so the more networks that you have, when you meet people at conferences, be nice, be polite, and they'll, in most cases, they'll remember you when you need a favor. And so those are some of the things that I want you, that I've tried to do. Critical reading. So after you got your full text article, there's this thing as critical. You want to read through the article. You want to look for two things. You want to look for internal validity. How well was the study designed, conducted, and interpreted and reported? So there's a lot of times when So the other thing that I want you guys to remember is that not because something is published in a scientific journal doesn't mean that it's error-proof. It doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean that it's superior, and so those are some of the things that I want you to take away from literature review or the idea of doing a literature review. There are sometimes the objective of the research study and the methodology that they use and the results that they're reporting are not aligned, which means that there's something that went wrong. They either skip a step or the quality of the methodology wasn't up to a good standard. So there are times that the internal validity of a research study is not very good, right? And then the other thing that I want you guys to think about is external validity, which is the generalizability. How likely is it that the result of this study applies to others and other populations? So say, for example, if I did a study here in Georgia, I can't say that my study that was only done in the state of Georgia is generalizable to the entire United States because I didn't do a multi-center or national level study. And so there are times where you have to think about how is this study externally valid to other population. And so there are times when, say for example, a researcher will attempt to do a national-wide study and look at a specific research topic or look at some clinical outcomes from a national standpoint. And in that point, it is a national study, and so the external validity is important. So the big thing that I want you to take away from here is the internal validity. So the internal validity is the study designed, how the study was conducted, interpreted, and reported. Is it well? Is it conducted well? Is the study conducted well? And you can tell, you can read a study and you can say, well, they're missing these clinical outcomes. So this study is not a complete assessment of the research topic or a complete assessment of the clinical topic. And so you can tell. But then also too, you can also look at the external validity. So how likely is it that this study applies to other population or is it generalizable to everybody so say for example, asthma. If you were able to look at an asthma study and an asthma study that was conducted in Baltimore in a low-income community where there's a lot of lead poisoning, is that study is that study generalizable to the suburbs of Florida, where there's less likely a possibility to have older buildings with lead poisoning? And so those are some of the things that you want to think about when you think about internal validity and external validity. There's another component of systematic or literature reviews is an annotated bibliography. Annotated bibliographies, I need to slow down. All right, so annotated bibliography, or AB, briefly summarize an article or report and how it relates to the proposed new project. So say, for example, annotated bibliographies are usually done by researchers, right? So I'm interested in doing a study, and I'm going to do a literature review. I'm going to select 10 or 15 papers, and my research topic is a specific research topic. And so I'm looking at the literature, I'm looking at the existing literature, and for every paper, I'm going to summarize that paper and say, okay, this is the limitation, these are the strengths of this paper, but here's my research, and here's how I'm going to decide to overcome those strengths and those limitations based on what I'm interested in doing. So you do an annotated or AB, and so you just briefly summarize a selection of articles or articles and how it relates to the new study that you're interested in doing.
It's just frozen.
So what makes, a lot of times, the main objective of research is to do some kind of original study. You cannot write, say for example, I had to write a dissertation. Most PhD students have to write a dissertation. Or if you're doing some kind of research project as a resident or as a fellow, you have to do some kind of original study. And so what is the definition of original? What makes something original? So an original study means that you're looking at some new exposure, a new disease, outcomes, a new population, or a new perspective. So if you're redoing something that's already been done, then it's not original. And a lot of times, you just have to put a little slant on your research to make it original in terms of, okay, I was able to do a study and I looked at a population only specific to Georgia, but then I decided, okay, I'm going to increase the population. I'm going to look at a new population. I'm going to look at Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. And that study, even though the methodology has been the same, did not change. The population is different because you have, instead of one population, you've increased it to now 3 or 4. So that makes it a little bit different. So what is the objective of original research, or what makes research original, is that these are the 4 characteristics. It's usually a new exposure from the one that you, or the researcher, or the body of literature conducted initially. It's a new disease, new outcomes. It's a new population, or you have a new perspective. All right, so the next part of the lecture for today, I don't have a lot, but the next part of the literature, not literature, stuck in my literature review head, but the next part of the presentation for today is going to talk about focusing on the research question. So the first part was focusing on literature review, second part focusing on the research question. All right, so there's essentially 3 types of research studies that you can do. You can do a primary research study, which collects data, new data from an individual. So say, for example, if you're working on some kind of clinical outcome as a resident, you're working at a children's hospital, and you're looking at children with, my area is cancer, I use cancer a lot, right? So you're looking at children with lung cancer, and you're doing a study that you're surveying children on the burden of disease. So you're surveying the children, and you're also surveying the parents, which are the primary caregivers. So because you're collecting new data, it's not something that is that you're getting from a data set or an existing research data. It's primary data. It's a primary data, or it's a primary study. Secondary study is you do an analysis of an existing data. So say, for example, same hospital, you're a resident of a children's hospital, and they have an existing data set where it's children with lung cancer, and the outcome was to look at time to death, right? So with that secondary study database, you can create a secondary study. And then, of course, you have tertiary studies, which reviews the existing literature. These are what we call systematic literature reviews. So typically, it's a couple of studies that has been published, and you're essentially pulling points from the studies to look at an overall outcome. And so tertiary studies are essentially reviews of existing literature or published studies. So this is figure 4-1, and it talks about primary, secondary, and tertiary research, and then it talks about essentially what I just went through in the previous slide. So primary, collect and analyze new data; secondary, analyze existing data; tertiary, reviews and synthesize the literature. So these are more systematic review studies. All right. So the other thing that I want to talk about today is, and I think this is my last slide. Nope, a couple more. All right. So key considerations. So study approach: collecting and analyze and do an analysis of new data. These are the key questions that you should think about. What are the possible sources of the population? Will it be possible to recruit enough participants when you're doing a primary data study? Analysis of existing data or secondary data. What are the possible sources of usable data for this files? What questions can be explored with the available data? So one of the limitations of secondary data collection or secondary data studies is that you're limited only by your research can only be confined to the data that you have available. So if it's not in your data set, then you can't study it. And then review of the literature. Does the researchers have does the researchers have access to adequate library resources? Can the researcher reasonably expect to acquire all of the needed articles? So review of the literature, you're essentially you're compiling a list of articles, you're compiling a list of studies, and essentially you're trying to do a review of the literature. All right. So the other thing that I want to talk about today, or the other component of the lecture, is conceptual and theoretical framework. We're not going to go into this too deep, but we're going to talk just brief overview of conceptual framework and theoretical framework. So whenever I'm doing a research study, from the behavioral standpoint, there's always a conceptual framework and there's always a theoretical framework that underpins the study outcome that I'm interested in. So the first thing is the conceptual framework. And the conceptual framework illustrates the key relationship between the variables that will be evaluated during the study. So relationship between the variables that will be evaluated to the study. I deleted something from this slide, but essentially it's the variables that's going to be evaluated. And I have two example slides that talks about conceptual framework and theoretical framework. Theoretical framework draws on the existing models in the literature to explain key relationships. So let me talk about these real quickly. So this is an example of a theoretical or conceptual framework, right? So say for example, it looks like a lot, but don't be confused. It's not, it's very, from this standpoint, it's very simple. So say for example, if I wanted to look at pharmacy school performance, right? This is, let me make sure I use this here. We have distance size. So say for example, I was interested in looking at pharmacy school performance. Right? I can look at, from the standpoint here, these are the relationships that are going to impact pharmacy school performance, right? So I can look at personal inputs, which is your gender, your health, your ethnicity. I can look at background and environmental influences, so where you're from, your learning experience. Where did you do undergrad? Did you complete undergrad? Did you get your BS before coming to pharmacy school? I can look at self-efficacy and your expectation. So when you came to pharmacy school, what did you expect? I can look at your interests, your goals, your actions, and then of course your exam scores. So essentially those are some of the things. This is just a conceptual framework. There is no, the big thing about the conceptual framework that I want you to talk about, it just illustrates the key relationship between the variables that will be evaluated in the study. So these are variables in my study that helps me to understand pharmacy school performance, as opposed to a theoretical framework which relies on something that is well documented in the literature to kind of get some understanding. So this is the health belief model. It's a model that was essentially produced in 1990. It's very well known. It's old, so you probably have a hard time reading it, but essentially this model, and it has been validated in the research literature. So typically you can look at socioeconomic factors or social demographic factors. These are education age, etc. Look at perceptions, and then you can look at, these all have an impact on health belief, or you decided to engage in some kind of health intervention. And so essentially, the difference between these two is theoretical framework essentially is well validated, well known, well established in literature, and then your conceptual framework is essentially something that you are essentially trying to map out for your study. And so, not necessarily well known, but typically what I do when I'm doing conceptual frameworks, I typically use theoretical framework to guide my conceptual framework. That makes sense. But essentially, I go to the literature, I feel something that is well validated, and then I go, okay, there must be some background factors, there must be some perception, and then I want to look at your performance in pharmacy school.
It's still trying to load my new session.
So I think the last part of the lecture, yep, that's it. Last part, we're going to talk about study goals and objectives. Go back here. So last part of our lecture for today, we're going to talk about study goals and specific objectives. So first, identify one clear overall study goal or study question, and then I'm going to take you back to the abstract at the beginning of the PowerPoint. I'm going to show you how the study was able to identify the study goal and then the study objective. So after you clearly identify the study goal or question, then you want to identify 3 or more specific objective aims or hypotheses that represent steps toward answering the main question. So typically you have study goals, and then you have specific objectives that the study you essentially want to accomplish with the study. So example of study goals, to describe the incidence or prevalence of a particular exposure or disease in a well-defined population, to assess the perceived health-related needs of the community. As it relates to your project, it could be, number 2 could be to assess the perceived health-related needs of the community. So or the pharmacy, so what's the need of the pharmacy that you're interested in evaluating? So that essentially is the specific study goal. So I'm going to quickly go back to the abstract example up front, and I'm going to show you the study goal and the study objective real quickly. So let's use this one. All right. So this is an example of the study goal. This is an example of the study goal. We describe the scope of knowledge, tools, and expertise required for the translation of complex genetics and genomic test information into clinical practice, right? That is an example of the goal. And then, an example of goal objective. The challenges of genomic counseling include the need for genetic and genomic professional education and multidisciplinary team training, the need for evidence-based information regarding the clinical utility of testing for genomic variant. So essentially, the researchers are giving you an example of what are the specific objectives of why the study goal is important. And so that's an example of, in a written article, an example of study goals, and then, of course, these study objectives. All right. So that's all I have. So the main objective for today was essentially looking at literature review and research questions. Next week, we're going to talk about descriptive study approach, analytical study approach. And so descriptive studies are essentially studies that describe or essentially give information about the population, and then analytical study approach, you're going to be doing some kind of data analysis. All right? So that's it. Thank you.
All right, someone
Any questions? Any concerns?
play on their EHR.
You can always send me an email or stop by my office.
I can't